Hello, 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 and welcome back to another episode of the Laugh at Pat podcast, #Patchats. This week, we are back with our German election special. That's right. When I was thinking, what direction can I take this comedy podcast next? I was like, how about a conversation about the upcoming German election and the intricacies of the German political system, because that is ripe for lots of giggles and ha-has. So I invited, dare I say, my friend? I think it would be at least fair to say my acquaintance, comedian Chris Doering, who has been on the podcast before and was gracious enough to come back again on short emergency notice for this very important German election special here on the Laugh at Pat podcast. The German election is this Sunday, September 26th. I know for my American friends, you're thinking, an election on a Sunday? That's crazy. It's almost like everybody wouldn't have work that day, so they would have access to voting. What a wild idea. Anyways, I invited Chris to come join me as my resident German expert, and we discussed the political spectrum of German political parties, the system that they have here in Germany. We talked about what the ballot kind of would look like for this election, and we talked about some of the history of the German political parties, the chancellor candidates. We also talked a bit about Angela Merkel and what her legacy is, and how Germans feel with her leaving office. And I think it is a interesting conversation. It was interesting for me. I think if you are someone who's interested in the German political process and what's going to be happening this upcoming Sunday, then maybe this will be an interesting podcast for you as well. If you're not into politics, or specifically German politics, there's a lot of other great content on this channel, and just go ahead and enjoy some of that, because that's probably going to suit you better, if I'm being just very straight up with you. One technical note about this podcast: this was my first attempt at doing a 3-camera shoot. We got the wide angle and then, the individual angles, because I got a fancy new phone to shoot video. And so I am recording this pre-editing process, so I don't know how that's going to come together. But if it's, some awkward editing, then that's why. Because I was attempting something new. If it came together beautifully and you're like, wow, this podcast production value continues to rise up, well, the content itself, no, I'm kidding. The content's great. But yeah, if you notice that's something new I tried this week, and I'm going to continue to try as I continue to book more guests here on the Laugh at Pat podcast. I have some new comedians here in Berlin that I want to reach out to and speak with. I want to continue to talk more to DJs and producers, and I have some people that I'm in the process of reaching out to and hopefully can get on the show. So lots more interesting conversations to come here on the Laugh at Pat podcast. But in the meantime, this week, the German election special with my friend and acquaintance, comedian Chris Doering. Follow him on all social media at comedian Chris D. Links in the description below. Check out him and some of Dragos's show and other guests on the podcast at Propaganda Comedy. And again, those links are in the description below, so check all that stuff out. And without much further ado, let's get into our lengthy discussion of the upcoming German election. Enjoy. All right.
Now a serious tone.
Now time to get serious. So, Welcome back to the most relevant political podcast in the world right now, the Laugh at Pat podcast. Thank you for coming back. Sure. So we're here to talk about the German election upcoming.
It's the greatest party in the state, in the nation.
Which, because, it's a comedy podcast, so I thought it would be good to have election coverage.
Since we had so much fun talking about the GDR last time, we're like, all right, let's keep this vibe going.
Yeah, exactly. We got to march it forward. But so I guess where I wanted to kind of, your credentials as my expert is that you're German.
Pretty much, yeah.
So thank you for.
Am I the only German you know? No.
Okay. I have many people, many Germans in my life, just not many that will take time on a Monday at 11 a.m. to talk with me for my podcast.
And your partner by this point is just tired of you just asking her stupid questions.
Oh, 100%. I'll like, oh, what do you think of the edit of this video? And she's like, it's nice. I'm like,
it's great.
I haven't hit
great
play
feedback.
yet.
It's
great feedback. But so I kind of wanted to start with the German political parties. My idea for this podcast for the viewers is I'm an American, and I feel like many of us are very the media in the States keeps being like, this election is a big deal for America somehow. But no one really knows how or how the system works. Right. And we're all kind of like, right. So you guys obviously have more than just two parties.
What? That's crazy.
Yeah. How do you choose?
How do you choose? That's a really good question. I don't know. So there's several different ways you can approach it. You can do it the old school way, where you just vote for the party you've always voted for, and your parents have always voted for. I feel like that's the majority of Germans, to be honest. So in that sense, it's not all that different from the US. And then the second way you can do it, you can actually look through the programs that the parties develop for each election, because they will write...
educate yourself?
Yes, exactly. So, and then you can go through that and basically look at, I've now looked at all of these, and this is sort of the party that actually represents what I want to do or what I'd like to happen the most. No one does that.
Yeah.
So in that sense, again, very similar to the US. However, we do have some assistance. I was telling you this just before we rolled this, where they have the Center for Political Education, which is state funded, and what they will do for every bigger election, so that's a state election or nationwide election, they will update this website called Ballots, and there they will have these analysts and political scientists scour through, I think I'm giving them too much credits. I don't know if they're necessarily political scientists, but there's people that work there who are really into politics, who then scour the individual programs that the parties have released, and then they will create a questionnaire based on all the issues that they found within the different programs and sort of the issues, and then there's an overlap between, because just like in all developed countries, they have these polls and questionnaires constantly happening, right?
Yeah.
So based on also what are the important issues, presumably based on those polls within the populace, they will then create this questionnaire of typically 30 to 40 questions. I think I did it yesterday, and I think it was 37 or 38. And then you basically, it's very simple. It's things like, would you because Germany as a country, so this is not part of the party program itself, but the country decided that we're going to get out of coal, producing energy from coal, right, by a certain date. And so one of the questions is, would you like that to be upheld? And then it's very simple for each. The question is yes, no, and neutral. So I'm for it, I'm against it, I'm neutral. And then at the end of the questionnaire, you can weigh some of the question, where you say, this is a really important issue for me specifically. And based on the results of that questionnaire for you personally, you can then compare all the different parties with one another, or specific ones, because maybe you already know I'm right wing, for me it's MPD or AFD. So you can just compare those with one another, and so it's just a question of like, how racist am I exactly? So, and then you compare
They're
those.
like brown people. For, neutral, against.
Which isn't that weird that sort of that their color, like political color, is brown, but that's the color they're really against in terms of skin tone.
Yeah,
that's such a weird,
I never
ironic
considered that, but
anyway, but then it shows you the overlap of your opinion based on the questionnaire and the party program. Yes.
Yeah.
And then what happens invariably is you will have picked sort of the big parties that are in the parliament at the moment, which currently I think is 5 or 6. I should know this. I'll go through them.
You are my expert.
Yes, exactly. We'll go through them in a second. And I'll figure out if it's actually 5 or 6. But then they've got all of these tiny, like some of them one-issue parties, like for instance the Tierschutz Partei, which is sort of the party for animal rights, used to be the one-issue party, but now when you look at their ads outside in your posters, they do everything now. They're basically like the new left, or they want to be like the new left and Greens kind of thing. So you have all of these very tiny parties as well, and most of them, because there's a right for them, since if they have the official party status, they have a right also to be observed within the Valomat thing. So you can just pick those, and invariably what happens when you do this thing is you will realize that your biggest overlap is with one of those tiny parties.
Okay.
And then you end up still voting for one of the bigger ones.
Okay,
so you scroll down to like number 3, number 4. Oh, that's the one that's actually viable. Okay, I'll choose that one.
That's interesting because my partner Anya took this test and she got the animal rights party, and
she decided not to vote for them.
Yeah, she was like conflicted. She was like, should I vote for the party that actually
has
aligns,
a chance of actually winning?
Yeah, or the one that has a chance at actually winning and is an American. I'm like, well, we're a lesser of two evils country, basically. That still ends up bombing somewhere, no matter what. But it's
not
progressive.
even a difference in where you bomb necessarily, is it? It's still going to be the same places.
But we're bombing progressively now.
Oh, okay, of course, that's good.
Yeah,
that's
it's
better.
good.
Like the drone strikes come just with a tiny
little
little bow on them.
helping to bomb, so it's good.
The drone bombs are gendered now, so that's good.
Well, we asked them what their pronouns were before we dropped them.
Good.
Yeah, no, but I mean, so there are still basically, 3 or 4 parties that are the ones that, like, if you want your vote to kind of count or matter. So if you vote for one of these small parties, I guess maybe here's where we should back up and start with, is like, so in the United States, you vote for your state senator, you vote for the president, and then there's also like these ballot initiatives that are basically like laws that are going to happen in your town or your state.
Sure.
What does a German ballot look like in a German election?
I mean, how deep do you want to go into the difference in like a representative democracy and like the thing that you've got going on?
Whatever the fuck that is.
Like, how do you want to actually go into that system?
I guess just like on a surface level, like you guys are voting for the chancellor?
No, we don't.
No,
okay, so that's a difference. So we do not, we don't elect directly the head of our state, but rather it's you vote for the party. Mm-hmm. So basically, we've got 2 votes essentially in every election. So if we take the nationwide election, for instance, currently next week we have an election coming up, which is the nationwide election. Concurrently, there's one happening for the state of Berlin as well. So, which means if you go there, you will vote twice, essentially, both for the state election as well as for the nationwide election. So if you look at the nationwide election, you will have 2 votes. One is for a direct candidate in your district, and the second one is for any party. So you can split the votes, which is what they always tell you. And if you want to vote tactically because you want to have certain coalitions happen, they always tell you, you should split your vote. Yeah, I don't know, maybe. And then what most people, however, do is, again, you go with the traditional way. So you vote for the direct candidate of your party, and then you vote for your party as well, just to back them up properly. And the way that works is, in your district, whoever gains the most vote, that's the direct candidate for that party, who will go in to the Bundestag, which is our nationwide parliament. And then on top of that,
would your district be like the city of Berlin, or the area of Brandenburg, or like how like minuscule or grand is a representative's like area?
I don't know if this, since this is an official podcast, how deep we can get. Do you have your Anmeldung yet? Yes.
Yeah.
The answer to that is C, senor.
Genau.
Exactly. So it basically tracks that. So basically the voting districts overlap with sort of like when you go to your Anmeldung, you register within a specific district in your city. So basically all cities, actually technically it's a county. All counties within all states of Germany are divided up in different voting districts, right?
Okay.
And then each of them has a direct representative for the parliament. So you would then vote for that district. For instance, in my case, that's Treptow-Köpenick.
Okay, gotcha. So you then would, if you're doing things the traditional way, you would vote for, if you're, say, interested in voting for the Green Party,
let's say,
you would vote for the Green Party candidate for this area you just said that I'm not going to try to repronounce.
Yes.
I'm like, I recognize it, but not going to try it. But you'd vote for this, and then you just vote for the Green Party as like a general party. And
so this is what I'm saying, like this is a question of how deep we want to get into it, because then it gets very interesting in terms of the distribution of seats in the parliament, because obviously there's a set number of seats for the direct candidates, and then they are based on the percentages that all the different parties get on top of that, or besides it rather, they get additional mandated seats there as well, so what you call Überhang mandates, and they will get them on top of the direct candidates they already have. So you have these weird constellations where sometimes a party will have very few direct candidates. That's typically a situation of the Greens, for instance. But they will have a high percentage of the party vote, so they get a lot of those. And then sometimes you have the case of some party. At this point, they're all corporate companies. Anyway, some parties. This has happened in recent decades a lot to the SPD, where they have a high number of direct candidates, but then their nationwide vote percentage is rather low. So then they have this weird sort of trying to balance that out thing happening, which is incredibly complex in the way they do it. And that then also changes how many seats there actually are in the parliament. So that is somewhat malleable. So there's not like a set number of seats every election cycle or every legislature in the parliament, but rather it depends on that interplay of direct candidates and percentages of the parties. So isn't that funny?
Yeah. Ripe for humor. No, but so is the parliament like incredibly large then? Because if there's a direct candidate for like basically your little neighborhood within the city of Berlin, and then there's all these different cities around Germany, and each one of those cities has a direct candidate for each little neighborhood, and then also the villages and it seems like it would be like
it's based on population size, of course. So sometimes there is districts in more rural areas that are incredibly large geographically, while in urban areas like in Berlin, some of them seem very small, but because again it's dependent on population size, so it's not that bad. I think currently we have I might be completely talking out of my ass here, but I think it's around 800 or something like that, which is incredible. Oh, I think, is it 700? I think that's it's an incredibly large number, I think, personally.
Like,
it's a really large number. It's a really large number. And there is movements around it, so everybody's saying this is just too much, it's getting out of control. Because if you look at the progression of it, it has gotten larger every legislature. It's just gotten more and more and more. And it's gotten to the point as well where people are like, this is just insane.
Does that have something to do with the fact that the German population is growing, or?
No, I don't think so, because that shouldn't change, because it's based on percentages. So it shouldn't change that at all. Yeah.
Okay. So there's this like 700 or 800.
Actually, you know what? While we're here, let's look it up. Like why? Well, being the expert that I am.
I'm sorry that I don't. That this isn't the Joe Rogan podcast, and I don't have like a Jamie.
Would you bring it up on screen, please?
Now's the time. But so
keep going. I'm still listening.
There's these X number of direct candidates, and then there's these additional number of seats that are given out based on which parties get the most percentage for the kind of like national party vote, and the parties pick those representatives. Like the people have no say. It's just like
yes,
so
essentially. I mean, it's all public, so you can look into it. You can actually look at the list. So they create these lists, right? So they will publish those lists. So let's say we already talked about the SPD and the Greens. So let's say the CDU, which is sort of the center-right major party, they will then publish the list for each state and basically say, in this state, if you vote for us on number 1, on number 2, on number 3, these people will get in. And then depending on the percentage, up until 57 they get in, or if they get a couple more percent more, it's like 58 gets in as well, right?
Yeah.
So you can kind of see, and then obviously at the very top, it's also the national figures that you would know, that you've seen in the news all the time. Like typically those are like the ministers, for instance. Like a lot of them are not direct candidates. Some of them are, like the ones that are actually popular. they will actually stand directly, because for that party it makes sense, because then they will have an additional direct seat to go in. But then you have a lot of like the party functionaries, I would call them. They are then on the list, right?
Okay.
And then they get in more or less safely, depending on how much percentage you get. So I just looked it up, and it was 709. And out of those, what I just saw is 111 were those sort of balancing seats that I just talked about. The difference between sort of percentage and the direct seats that all the different parties got. Which means that the original parliament of just direct mandates is a little less than 600.
Okay. So you go in this German election, which is on Saturday, the 26th?
No, it's Sunday.
Sunday.
Yeah, it's always on a Sunday.
Always on a Sunday. Makes a lot more sense than a Tuesday, or whatever they do in the States. But so you go in and you're going to vote for basically the person in your area, and then you're going to vote for whichever party you think is going to best represent. And that's it. There's just basically 2 things on the ballot.
That's pretty much it. We don't have any ballot initiatives. Sometimes they do that, but I think that's the same in the States, if I'm not entirely mistaken, where that's dependent on the state. So every state can sort of bring up certain initiatives, and I think that's the case here as well, where sometimes there's certain initiatives that will be brought on as well. Right. So I think currently, I don't know if they passed the threshold, but I do believe that the whole issue around whether or not they want to buy back housing from all the major companies here, housing companies, I think that's a ballot initiative that is on the ballot at the moment.
And that would be for the state election of Berlin.
Yes, exactly. And so that's not a nationwide election. So nationwide, that doesn't exist. For the state elections, that does exist.
And do states have different, like, is Frankfurt having a local election?
I was just going to say, yes, actually, I just realized when I said that for state elections, that is true, but it's also for communal elections. I'm sorry. So when I was in Dresden, when I lived there and studied there, they did have a ballot initiative as well when it came to building a bridge there. So there was a very controversial bridge they wanted to have built. And
I'm sorry, but
a controversial bridge, yes.
Controversial bridge that piques my interest. You can't just let that slide. What makes a bridge controversial?
Well, so they had a very old crumbling bridge that they wanted to have replaced, and then there was a whole issue around traffic in terms of like, hey, the traffic is flowing around this, and it becomes really congested around these choke points. So let's just build a huge fucking bridge in between. Now, Dresden has status as a UNESCO World Heritage Site because of its sort of natural site, specifically sort of around that whole area, sort of around the river, sort of you get this all natural side to it. So then they wanted to build this huge, massive fucking cement bridge there in the middle, and then people were just up in arms and kind of like, no, that's not cool. And then also it got to the point where the UNESCO basically said, well, if you build that, then that title is gone. You're not World Heritage anymore for that. And that
like,
became
but what if we make it pretty? maybe.
Which, by the way, was never on the table. In typical German fashion, it's like, no, that's no issue. No.
But it doesn't function.
Yes. Why would I make it pretty? It costs more. No, rather we spend a lot more on just deciding whether we want to build it or not. So it was this whole thing that went on for years. And then the other side, I mean, as much as at the time I felt like, I think this bridge is not, we don't need to build it.
Yeah.
Because there's this old adage also in transport science, which is, because the layman's wisdom is, there's too much traffic, let's build a bigger street here, and then that will lay traffic. But the reality is that's not true. The more streets you build, the more traffic there will be, because streets, ironically, not really, they attract traffic.
Yeah.
Because you build the street or a bridge, and people will drive over
the Field
it.
of Dreams thing. Build it and they will come.
Precisely.
Yeah.
So in reality, it doesn't really alleviate traffic, and not even necessarily in other ways, because there's now new decisions of people making, I'm having a much easier way now going by car here, so instead of taking the tram, I will actually go by car. So it actually does attract traffic instead of alleviating that whole situation. Anyway, so then so as much as I thought at the time I was sort of an opponent of that whole project, the other side, so basically my side, became more and more ludicrous in the way they tried to stop it on technicalities. So what they went and did, because at a certain point, once they're at that point where saying, well, we're building that bridge now, like we're doing it, then it's really just sort of technicalities and can stop it. So things like, and that's what they ended up doing, is, the bridge goes through the natural habitat of like a specific type of bat that's endangered. So no, we can't do that.
Yeah.
So there was what was it called? I think the horseshoe bat.
Okay.
The horseshoe bat is an endangered species in that area.
Shout out the horseshoe bat.
Bam, bam, represent. And so that's one of those things where they just tried to find a couple different endangered species and kind of pretended, kind of really found them around them. But he said, well, we can't do it on that technicality. We can stop the whole project.
Yeah.
And that also just made it much longer, more costly, because essentially what they ended up doing, they obviously didn't say, then we'll scrap the project. But rather what they did is they paid study after study to figure out, well, how can we build it slightly differently in a way where we're not going to endanger their natural habitat. It's just a whole mess. And then in the end, the initiative was, fuck all this nonsense, let's just build a goddamn bridge. And then eventually they did.
And did they lose their UNESCO heritage?
They did, yeah, they did.
Huh. Well, this is my problem, is I'm like very curious, and I could ask like several more questions, but I feel like it's not
other
what
follow-up
everybody
questions.
Else,
Yes,
everybody else is maybe not as excited about the idea of
the horseshoe
transport
bat.
science. So to get back to
so we were talking about sort of initiatives. So what I'm saying is, so in statewide elections, as well as communal elections, they have these ballots that are on these initiatives that can be on the ballot as well.
Yeah.
Not for nationwide elections though.
Okay.
For federal elections, no.
Gotcha. So maybe now we could talk a little bit about the parties, because
So as far as I understand, in the US, you have a right-wing party and a far right-wing party. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
So
the fun thing is there are some center-right people within the right-wing party.
Yeah.
But then they mostly just vote with the right wing. So yeah,
which makes sense. You don't want to lose your seat in the end.
Exactly. But so maybe we could start with the CDU.
Yes. Do you know what that stands for?
Christian Democratic
Union. Yes,
okay. Yes. I knew it was Christian because I remember being like, that's weird.
Gross.
Yeah.
It's like,
yeah. Our parties hide the fact.
Yes, very well. Yeah. They have with the last candidate, I believe.
So that is Angela Merkel's party.
That's her whole jam. Yeah, that's a posse, her crew.
That's her crew. That's who she's repping. And
shout out to Angie.
Yeah, it's interesting though, because you said the CDU is the center right party of Germany, which like I feel like in the States Merkel is really put up as like this ideal liberal leader.
I mean, first of all, sort of the compass of where the center is different in different countries. First of all, so they are center right for
wrong,
us,
and in some places it's a little closer to right.
I wouldn't even go that far, but it's sort of so. First of all, so when we say center right, it's center right for Germany, number one. Which, to be perfectly fair, is, I would say, within the European context, or let's say the Western European context, is a little bit more on the conservative side already as a country. But the peculiarity of the current CDU, specifically under Angela Merkel, is that they've been much more to the center than any previous CDU iteration ever. Because what they decided to do, and this goes back a little bit into the history, I think we talked about this a little bit on the last podcast, where what the SPD did at the very beginning of the 21st century with the Chancellor we had at the time, Gerhard Schröder, their whole thing was, we want to modernize the country. So we're all about these very progressive policies, and they were so progressive that it just fucked up the country completely with this neoliberal economics, and then basically people were understandably mad at the left party, the center left party, who just enacted this incredibly fucked up, like almost like right-wing policies, economic policies, that the center was up for grabs because there was no center-left party currently. So what Angela Merkel then did, well, if you guys don't want it, I'll take it. So she got a lot of flack at the time, so the early 2000s, for doing that, basically taking positions that normally would have been taken by the SPD. So almost...
So the SPD, sorry, yes, just to like... On. For me, it's like very interesting to talk about like what... liberalism and conservatism is in a different country, because like in the States, for example, to me, so much of it is wrapped up in like social issues. You know, They talk a lot about like taxes and stuff, but really, if you talk to people about what issues are separating,
it's the gays.
It's the gays. It's the abortions. It's, you know,
it's the gay abortions.
Yeah,
those are the worst.
Those are the worst abortions. Maybe there's an app for that. So what?
This whole thing is just a ploy for you to do your startup pitches.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Space Medusa. It's all a promo. But so like, what would be like a something that the SPD would have, typically a position they would have taken that Merkel kind of like got in? Do you remember an example by any chance?
I'm trying to remember. I think.
I guess the point of my question is, was it more business related stuff or was it social stuff? Because that's something I don't understand about the German political, like the difference between a CDU voter and an SPD voter.
I think it was around. That's a good question. I think it was more on those like softer issues, if I remember correctly, where. I honestly don't remember as much. I do remember, because that was sort of a very memorable moment for me, that when she took over, she actually thanked Gerhard Schröder as like the previous chancellor, so for all of his good work. And I think that's kind of, you know, that's kind of a nod when, you know, like when your political opponent is thanking you for your work, you kind of know that you fucked up.
You got me elected, basically. I didn't even have to.
No, but it wasn't. No, it's not. She wasn't saying sort of for like thanks for being elected, but basically for the work that you did in your previous legislature, for all the policies you enacted. Like, thank you for that. Like, I didn't have to do it. You did it.
Okay, yeah.
So, and now I'm the beneficiary of this thing, because I'm not going to be blamed for it, but it's exactly the kind of stuff that I wanted to do.
Yeah.
So I think that's what that was. And so then I think that gave her more leeway to go into sort of more soft issues. I think it was, if I remember correctly, there were things around, because minimum wage came later, so it couldn't have been that. Was there something around unions? I don't remember exactly, but I think, yeah, again, there were maybe some softer issues that they were working with that were sort of further, like, again, she got flagged for that from sort of the CDU at the time, where they basically say, hey, listen, I think it was on taxation as well, some taxation stuff, where they were basically, hey, this is not what we do, like, we want to keep it conservative, man. Yeah. And she's like, no. There's a lot of people here that they can just vote for us. Why not just grab them? And then that's what she did, essentially. She plonked herself down as the new CDU, which is now straight up in the middle. Like we do all of it. We're like a one-stop shop for politics.
And I mean, that's been a kind of an unbeatable strategy for her, right? I mean,
pretty much, yeah. And I think if she would have stand in again for another election, she very likely would have won. I wouldn't have been happy with it, but she very likely would have won.
Yeah, that's another. So that's another.
Again, it's not her because we don't elect them directly, but like her as the head of a party would have significantly raised the percentage that they would have gotten.
That's another interesting thing because again, in the States, I think Merkel is looked at as this like beacon of like great leadership and
which is so funny to me. I don't know. I don't understand it. I have this discussion with my dad all the time because my dad is a bit of a fan of hers. And I just don't understand it because how can someone that is just so indecisive be a great symbol for leadership? I don't understand it. Someone who stands for the status quo so much and sort of has effectively halted progress in Germany for like the past 16 years. How can they stand for leadership? Like I don't understand that. What's confusing to me on that end is if she was upheld specifically by the Republicans in the US for that, I'd get that. That's because that makes sense. But since she's upheld quite a bit by the Democrats in those terms, I do not understand where that infatuation is coming from.
But would it be fair to characterize Merkel's CDU as a little bit more closer to what the Democrats' platform or the Democrats' platform would be than the Republicans? Because
maybe,
I mean, like for example, I'm super uneducated about this part, but like immigration, which is like such a hot button issue in the States, and it seems like you guys have have been very progressive from an outsider's perspective, uneducated outsider's perspective, towards, immigrants and refugees and stuff. I know there's obviously problems, but definitely more accepting than the States, it seems.
To be fair to Merkel, as much as I'm sort of a critic of her, I have just been critical in the last couple of sentences, I think that's the one issue where she did actually show tremendous leadership. That's like the one time where it's like, I can be proud of this head of state, where it's like, wow, this is actually really, really good. When it came to the refugee crisis and her standing firm, even against popular opinion. That's like the one time she actually, because her whole thing as a political animal, her whole thing was, let's look at the polls, let's see what the majority wants, and I'll do that. That's not a bad strategy, and that's basically what her whole thing has been. So no matter where sort of the political wind goes, that's where she is at. And that was the one time, though, even against political opposition, where she stood firm and she said, no, this is the right thing to do. We'll let them in. So I thought that was great. And that's what I'm saying. In her defense, that was a great moment. That was a great moment of leadership, actually. And that was fantastic. However, outside of that, and I think that kind of blinds the perception a little bit in terms of like, oh yeah, you're really progressive. When it comes to immigration, I think Germany overall is a really regressive system because we're very strict rules when it comes to immigrating here, and worse than that. So having strict rules, I mean, you can debate that. There's good reasons, I think, on either side of the argument for saying like why you should have strict rules, why you shouldn't have, who you let in, who you don't let in. That's essentially up to every country more or less to decide for themselves. So I don't want to get too much into that. However, whatever set of rules you have, the real issue here in Germany is once people are here, that's when it really all goes wrong, because there's no real system for how to deal with immigrants in terms of like how to integrate them, sort of how they can adapt to society, to what level they should adapt. So there's all this sort of let's say expectations from people that are not really necessarily connected to the actual rules of what you should or shouldn't do, and so there's this whole level of disconnect where people are going, well, I did follow the rules, like I'm doing what I'm supposed to do, and there was like, yeah, but come on, you're living here, you should be learning the language, and you should have a glorious German mustache and wear a jeans jacket. Like, why are you not integrating here? Are you unwilling to integrate? And so there's this whole weird disconnect in terms of what the actual rules are and what the expectations from the people are, essentially.
So I just want to talk a little bit more about Merkel, and then we can move on. But I'm wondering, from your perspective, what do you think what do you think was her most celebrated accomplishment, and what was the thing that like she took the hardest hit generally from the country on?
I mean, her highlight reel for sure is refugee crisis, going through like basically what everyone's adopted now in the pandemic as an economic crisis. Everybody adopted sort of the German way of doing Kurzarbeit, which she used as a tool predominantly for the financial crisis of 2009. So that's part of a highlight reel.
What is that? Sorry.
Oh, sorry, Kurzarbeit. So it's a policy where companies are allowed to get state benefits for their workers. So basically, they pay them. Again, rules are always extremely complex, but they pay them a certain percentage of their normal wage still, even though they work less. And again, depends on the position, what they do exactly. So sometimes they work 50%, sometimes they work 0%. They're just at home, but they're still employed by their employees. And then the employers get money from the government to do that. And then again, depending on the exact situation, they get a certain percentage of that. So that means that enables companies to still employ their workers and don't have to, like after the crisis, when they go back to normal, they don't have to look for new workers because they still have all their staff. But it doesn't put the entire burden on them on having to pay all these people who are now currently unproductive because of the crisis. So that's sort of very useful tool to just keep employment numbers high and to keep people employed, and just essentially it's a great social policy as well if you think about it, because like people then are not as stressed and as affected by the crisis as well, because they know I've got a job to go back to. Again, every individual situation is different, because some people then still some companies still lay off people then afterwards if the crisis goes too long and whatever. But in general, I think it's a good policy. So that's part of a highlight reel. After the whole Fukushima thing, she then sort of stood up firm immediately, went like, all right, Germany, we're done with nuclear power. That's it. We're out. And that's definitely part of her highlight reel. What else? Actually, I'm getting to the end of the list now. I can't think of many other things. I'm like, that was actually quite good.
If you were to ask a German, like a German you meet on the street, obviously people have a wide range. Which street you're on matters. But like, what would you say? Like, some things were that like most Germans were kind of like, what the fuck?
Well, actually, I do think, speaking as a sort of a more progressive voice myself, I do feel like the whole refugee crisis did hit her hard politically. Because, again, that's the one time she stood against popular opinion. And I think, again, saying that, reiterating Germany as a whole is a more conservative country than specifically you would experience here in Berlin, where you feel like, it's, multiculti, everything is cool. But as a country as a whole, I think we're pretty conservative, and I think that cost her and her party, and this is why a lot of people in the CDU were quite mad at her as well, obviously, cost her quite a lot of points. And you could argue it enabled the rise of the AfD as sort of this right-wing party that's taking up a lot of space in the right spectrum of the political spectrum. So that definitely had cost her politically. Other fuckers, I'm trying to think. I think but that's the thing with crises. I think there was a lot of things within the financial crisis that she could have dealt with, but I felt generally, as much as comparatively, Germany did kind of went through it okay, specifically when it came to employment, because that was a large focus of her programs. I still feel there was a lot of things, just a lot of fucked up things happening, just like in all other countries as well, in terms of, all right, let's pull out this safety net for all these banks. And so I think there is a lot of people, specifically on the left-hand side and the progressive side, were like very mad about how she handled that. Yeah.
And how
burn the banks. Yeah. Eat them. Eat the bankers.
Eat them before they eat us.
Yes, that's progressivism for you right there. It's all about cannibalism. Which is ironic if you know more about German politics, because the Greens used to be like, they had this whole issue, a whole scandal about like they used to be for pedophilia apparently in the 80s. Yes. Yes. Anyway, so progressivism.
The last thing I wanted to ask you about Merkel was, like, I was talking to my godfather about this, and I actually saw an article too that like how will Germans deal with her leaving? I mean, you guys have had the same leader for, I mean, has it been 16 years?
It's been 16 years, yeah.
16 years. Like,
going on 17. Yeah.
And the article I read was like, Germans' outlook on future, like, not bright without Merkel, which, I mean, it's probably a conservative take, but like, is there a sense?
I think I think that's fair. And again, pointing to my dad, who's a bit of a fan of hers, I think he's a bit disconcerted with the choices coming up, because specifically, well, again, he's not normally on sort of the center right part of the political spectrum. I would identify more sort of center left, but if you kind of feel like, oh, it's the new CDU under Merkel, and they're kind of trying to try to stay successful, they've tried to portray that image a little bit of like, yeah, we're gonna stay the course, we're gonna keep in this vein of politics. So if you believe that, and so as a CDU, you want to also keep like that big chunk of the voters in the middle. But then you see who's coming up next. So their candidate, Armin Laschet, is just he's a tool. I don't know. Yeah. I don't know how to describe him best. He's just a tool. He's an idiot, basically. And so yeah, everybody is just very much saying, what the fuck are we doing here?
Yeah.
So I think they're gonna lose, and they already lost quite a bit of voters in the center. They're just not gonna go for that. And I feel a lot of people, even on the right hand side of the CDU, are just very disheartened, let's say.
Yeah. So maybe we could go. Could we
want to go into the candidates now?
I was hoping maybe we
the
could
parties
just,
still.
Yeah, walk through the spectrum of the parties. Like, so, because you mentioned on the, like you said, on the far right.
Let's take this in the middle. All right, let's start in the middle.
Okay.
Let's in the middle. So middle, you've got
the middle.
The middle. All right. Then let's take, so from your perspective, so middle right is the CDU, and they've got a union with the CSU.
Which is Bavaria.
But
basically the same thing?
It is the same. Well, the thing is, to understand that, you have to kind of understand the history and the culture of Germany a little bit. Like, Bavaria is essentially the Florida of Germany, okay? If that makes sense.
That inspires an image, yes.
Yes. And so just to go back to the history of Germany, so Germany as a state, as a nation state, is very young, much younger than most of the other nation states. So we only got together as a one unified nation in 1871. Mm-hmm. Up until that, it was only all of these little kingdoms and duchies and so on and so forth. And so that has a very, very long tradition of independence within the different states that we have. And Bavaria being sort of the prime example of that. And they, as always, they have these weird notions similar to the Texans about like, oh, we're going to secede, like we're going to have our own little thing because we're like the best and the strongest and whatever. It's just a bunch of cunts, really. Yeah. Having said that, as you can sort of be down on the Bavarians as much as you want, and I encourage you. Their marketing,
anti-Bavaria.
Their marketing, incredible.
Yeah.
Their marketing is incredible because when you think it's similar to the Texans actually. When you think of a German outside of Germany, you think of Bavarians. You think of Oktoberfest, you think of like idiots and those Lederhosen and that stuff. That's all Bavaria. That's no one else. And it's the same way. You think of America outside of Americans, you think of like, big hats, cowboy boots, you know what I mean? So that's that stereotypical image.
And if you tell that to anybody else in the country, like when I first came to Germany and I asked Anya, really legitimately, I was like, oh, do you have one of those dresses? And she's like, no.
The fuck is wrong with you? What's wrong with you?
Yeah.
And not cringe in the sense that, oh, that's old school and old fashioned, but cringe in the sense that, why would I wear something? It's like asking you, do you have like one of those sombrero hats?
Yeah.
Because you come from North America, right? Don't you have like one of those sombrero hats, a little guitar, and play around with a little mariachi band? Isn't that what you do? Yeah. You know what I mean? So it's that. So it go, and that's what I mean culturally, that it goes that deep, where the differences in the different states and sort of different peoples within Germany and their dialect, it goes that deep, where we're like quite different people. Anyway, so CDU, CSU on center right, then center left, it would be the SPD normally.
Which okay, so Christian Democratic Union and the SPD is the.
Do you know?
No.
Social Democratic Party.
Social Democratic Party. Okay.
Yes. So
okay.
then let's go a little bit further right. I would say there I would probably put the FDP.
Okay.
You know those?
No.
Those are, so their color mostly is yellow. They're the liberals. They call themselves the liberals. They're the Free Democratic Party.
Okay.
Yeah. Then on the other side, well, I don't even know if I would necessarily put them more left, but that's how they're perceived. Let's say a little bit further left of the SPD are the Greens.
Yeah.
A little bit further left of them is the left, Die Linke.
Linke.
Exactly. And then on the other side, so further right, is I would probably put the AfD. Yes, the
And
Alternative for Germany.
And those are the ones who are kind of like the
Anti-immigration,
pro, like kind of like white German.
Pretty much.
Thing.
Yeah. They are perceived as sort of the racist party.
Yeah. Is that
rightfully
true?
so? To a large degree, I would say. The thing is, they also have a little bit of a complicated history because they got started as an anti-Euro party, and by that I mean not necessarily European. Although I did feel they were a little anti-European, but they were mostly like anti-Euro, the currency.
Okay.
Because they were all about like fiscal conservatism and like the euro is gonna break us all, and so they got started as that, but then they got just taken over completely by sort of this really nasty wing of the AfD that was all about anti-immigration. I think there was a time around the refugee crisis where they just really sort of like took over the whole thing and basically said like, fuck this, no more immigrants and all of this sort of stuff. And then also in that typical fashion of this type of politics, like not even making any differentiation between like, you know, immigrants in general and like, asylum seekers and all of this sort of nonsense. So and now they're just that, like that's their whole thing now. And so those are the major parties. So that's 6 actually. So it's not 5, it's 6 that are. Those are all the parties that are in the parliament currently. And then you have all these tiny. So further right, I would probably put something like the NPD, like the Nationalistic Party of Germany. Then further left, you have something like the Marxist-Leninist Party, like what's it called? DKP, I think it's called. And then you've got a ton of small ones of in between, let's say. Yeah. This is one that a lot of progressive find very exciting, Volt. They're like the young European party, like very pro-Europe, for a lot of progressive progressive policies. And I've read a couple of op-ed pieces recently where people are like, yeah, this is why you shouldn't vote for Volt. From progressive voices, where it's that whole tactical game where they're all like, if you vote for Volt, you're wasting your votes. So they're basically saying Volt is the right party for you, but you shouldn't be voting for them.
Okay. And so would those people say vote for our individual candidate in your area, but then vote for the
opt-in pieces? Yeah, exactly. The opt-in
something?
pieces, they were all about like, we don't really like the Greens all that much, but you gotta vote for them. Like if you want like a sliver of your agenda to actually make it through and influence the future coalition, then government coalition, I mean. Then you need to essentially vote for the Greens instead of Volt, because Volt's not, first of all, they're not going to make it into parliament, and then secondly, even if they did, it's not going to make a big difference for the actual coalition building, and the percentages that they get, they will most likely take from the Green voters, which is then percentage that's missing from the Greens, for which they could be in the coalition. If they don't have the percentages, they won't be in the coalition, meaning what you care about won't even be affected in the next government.
Okay.
Which I understand that argument, but at the same time, I don't, because this goes back to the whole question about why you should vote and who you should vote for. Because again, you do the Wahlomat, you see, my biggest overlap is actually one of the tiny parties, but I'm going to still vote for one of the big parties anyway, because that's the way you should do it tactically. At the same time, everyone who's somewhat educated sort of knows cynically your individual vote is not going to matter anyway. Like mathematically, it's not. This is not going to matter who you vote for individually. So that's the cynical take. Like out of that, there's 2 options you go, where you're like, fuck it, I'm not going to vote. Or you still have that sense of civic duty where you go like, well, it's my duty as a citizen, I need to vote, so I will. But that's why I'm like, well, if you're already at that point where it's like my vote is not going to count anyway, then just vote for who you want to vote for. You know what I mean? Like if you play all these tactical games in your mind in terms of like, oh, I can vote for them even though I don't really want to, the lesser evil strategy essentially, then why are you even voting at all? If you go at that point you really shouldn't vote. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So if you are going to vote and knowing that it's not going to matter on an individual, just vote for the candidate you want to vote for.
Yeah.
That's my take on that.
So I want to talk about the coalition thing in a second, but one last question about the parties. But so you kind of you were like, as we were doing this thing, the kind of anti-immigration party, you put opposite of
on the right. Yes, I did.
On the right, opposite of Die Linke, which is like the left, and it, I'm from San Francisco, so obviously I grew up thinking, the left is always good, and so then here I was like, Die Linke, right? The left, that seems like a good thing, and people are like, well, they're a bit like, it's a bit much. It's a little, I don't know. So,
they're left, but they're too left.
They're so far left, it's almost right. But so, could you just...
It's a circle. That whole spectrum really is a circle.
Yeah.
But to be perfectly blunt with you as well, like I like that whole spectrum thing, I've never really... Because that's why I also sometimes have issues when people put the Greens left of the SPD. I sometimes have issues with that, because to me, the Greens are really conservatives in green clothing. Because when it comes to social issues, even though they talk all the progressive talk, when you see their actual policies, and even when it comes to ecological policies, which is the center, that's what they call the Greens, the center of their policies, it's very conservative. Like a whole big thing of theirs is like, well, if anybody would just buy ecological products, then we could easily, save the planet. Sure, if everybody had the money to do that, that would be lovely too, and then we will all live in gummy bear land. That would be great. So I feel like, they have a lot of very socially regressive ideas in terms of where they don't really care that much about people who are not that well off. And that's a bit of an issue that I have with the Greens, why I wouldn't even necessarily put them further left of the SPD, to be honest.
Yeah.
Because to me, the Greens is really just the CDU, but sort of with an ecological awareness.
So there are the Greens more like, because you mentioned that they're saying like, putting it on people to like make these personal choices and stuff. And to me personally, being uneducated on the subject, I would love to share my opinion.
Go for it.
It's
the first time this happened to me with an American.
But I mean, to me, it always seems like no one ever is like, no political parties are ever like, we need to like really regulate companies and make them not be fucking up the environment and not just like put it on consumers to make choices or whatever. So do they have policies that would try to do that? Like what?
Partially. So they do have systems where they want to go through economic policies. For instance, they had a hard push in what the EU eventually enacted in terms of having this cap and trade system for carbon dioxide within the European Union. That system got a little fucked because they had too many certificates, where basically it was easy for them to sell them on and off for very cheap prices, because the overall cap, not for the individual companies, but the overall cap for all the certificates was just too high. Okay. Then they do have the progressive policy in it, where like every couple of years ago it becomes lower and lower, but it just started way too high, which meant that the overall system and policy was ineffective. So they did push for certain things like that. They are also pushing for certain regulations for like agriculture, like ecological agriculture, to get that a bit more supported and subsidize it a bit more. Like a big push of the Greens when they were in the federal government in the early 2000s was this whole thing about energy policy. So they had this whole huge subsidy for solar and wind energy. So if you produce solar energy or wind energy, you get a subsidy from the government to basically sell it on to the government or to a energy provider for more money than it should cost, essentially. And that gave rise to sort of this huge sector and huge industry in solar power and wind energy here in Germany. So that's good. But a lot of it, what it also means is, so if you increase the regulations on a lot of these things and the way that's built up is, it just makes a lot of these products more expensive. And if you don't subsidize them additionally, then, and that's what the situation that we have right now, where ecological products are a lot more expensive than sort of traditional products when you look at sort of agriculture products, for instance. So your fair trade and organic eggs, they're obviously more expensive than sort of the regular eggs. So there's no easy solution to this. In terms of one that has been proposed a lot of times is just take away the subsidies from the traditional products. The problem with that is a lot of the subsidies are not direct subsidies, but rather sort of inherent subsidies, where the external costs through the productions that we all bear as a society, that we all pay for through pollution and all this sort of stuff, are not borne by the producers. So then one of the things that people have produced, well, they need to pay for that, essentially. Yeah. But that comes across not as taking away subsidy, but it obviously politically comes across as, well, you're just taxing them higher, just enacting more taxes. And not only are you making the organic eggs cheaper, but rather the only thing you're doing is just making more stuff even more expensive.
Which hurts poor people.
Which hurts predominantly not well-off people, exactly. Yeah. So that becomes a whole issue in and of itself. And I've found so far that the Greens haven't really found a good way around that conundrum. And again, I'm not saying that there is an easy answer to that. However, for someone who, and there's a lot of them who spend their living thinking about this and doing all of this stuff, I feel like most of the answers they've come up with just fall short of any really good solution. Yeah.
Okay. Well, so what's been happening is it's been at this coalition government, right, which has been with the CDU and the SPD?
That's the one. So they call that the Grand Coalition, because it's basically both of the center parties together.
We're basically very similar.
Think of it if the Democrats and the Republicans would unite in a coalition. Think of that. Like, how fucked would that be? And that is sort of a lot of people's feelings, where basically everybody agrees we don't want that anymore. But given how fractured the spectrum at the moment is, it might end up happening again, because that what happened the last election. Last election, everyone was sick of the Grand Coalition. Everyone was like, fuck this shit, because previously they even had so much power. They had so many seats in the parliament that they could change what you would call the constitution. Right, we have this thing called the Grundgesetz, so we don't have an actual constitution, but we sort of have this basic law which is essentially like a constitution. And they had so much power because they had 3/4 of the seats, 2/3 of the seats, and then later 3/4 of the seats. They could just change things within sort of the basic structure of our laws. And they did, in fact. One of the things that they enacted was this stop for debt. So they had a debt stop in there where it basically says not only is a normal law, but it's now within the Constitution that up to a certain percentage, like we can put on more debt on the federal household that is proposed, and that can be enacted by the parliament. National debt I'm talking about. So when the parliament wants to pass something like that, it runs afoul of the constitution. They
have to,
which obviously brings on legal challenges.
Pay for it. When they propose it, rather
precisely.
than just,
precisely. And it's not a zero debt thing where it's not like they can't put any debt into their balance, but it's like up to a certain percentage, and then they can't do more. They've gotten around with that during crisis times, because I think when they enacted the law, there were like a certain caveats in it where like in crisis times, blah blah blah. So they've gotten around it during the pandemic. But in general, it's really tough now for any sort of progressive policies that need investment. And that's why, and again, that's one of the reasons why we had the status quo situation here in Germany. And Germany now is becoming more and more famous for just having terrible infrastructure, terrible digital infrastructure, first of all, but even just the regular infrastructure Germany used to be sort of known for. It's just all crumbling, and it just needs major, major investments. And it might be the case that they just can't make those investments because of what they did then.
So the
anyway, sorry to interrupt you again. So that was a problem then, and what happened in the last election is, because of the way the votes came about, the only really viable coalition was again the Grand Coalition, where the SPD was basically, no, we're not doing this again before the election. Then afterwards, they got kind of shamed into it because what happened is they had talks with the Liberals, the FDP, as well as the Greens. So they wanted to do like what they call like a lights, traffic lights coalition. And but then the Liberals basically went out and they said like, no, we don't want to do this. Like, if we can't do the right policies, we're not going to do any policies. That was basically the thing. At which point, so they had these talks already for like 1, 2, 3 months. At which point, then it was like, well, then what are we going to do? Because the Liberals and the CDU didn't have enough seats. So then now it's a question of, are we going to have a minority government? Or, well, what are we going to do? At which point, eventually, SPD then relented and said, all right, let's do this again. We want to have a stable government. We prefer a stable government over an unstable minority government. So then that's what they went for. And it's been another 4 years of everybody being sick of it.
And when with this type of grand coalition, is it like a big problem in the States, right? Is like... because the Republicans and Democrats have gotten more and more confrontational, like less and less gets done.
Well, here it's the opposite, actually.
The problem is they're getting too much done, and it's not good stuff.
Yes, exactly. Yes. No, the problem is that they become more and more the same. Like the big issue with the Grand Coalition is actually the big issues for the SPD, because they keep hemorrhaging voters. Because again, the whole strategy, the winning strategy of Angela Merkel is, I'll just take the SPD's positions, just cut out sort of the very progressive, the actual left and progressive stuff I'll cut out, but the rest I'll take. So that means the SPD is part of a coalition of it's like everything good that gets done. Oh, it's Angie.
Yeah.
Boom. Anything that bad gets done, well, it's the CDU and the SPD. I can't vote for that. So the SPD has just hammered voters over the last decade and a half. I mean, it all started again with Schroeder, really. But so yeah, it's been a big issue for them, where they really want to be in the opposition now, just to create some kind of profile for themselves again, or be, I think, in a more sort of left-leaning government. Essentially, I don't think even that doesn't have to be that left-leaning, but basically in the government without the CDU, just to be on their own.
And after I read that, like after kind of like the Corona stuff, like CDUs,
shout out to the Rona.
Yeah. Shout out the Rona. Shout out Wuhan.
The clan we're talking.
Yeah, exactly. Shout out the lab. No. Anyways, but like, so the CDU's like approval rating has kind of is at a all-time
plummeted
low,
currently.
And so is the projection that a lot of those voters will vote for the SPD? Or is everybody kind of...
Interestingly enough, so on the further right side, they're going to the AfD. On the middle and further left side, they're going to the Greens, actually, which is why the Greens have surged. Now, they have had a couple of scandals with their leading candidate at the moment. Well, not at the moment, this is a couple of months ago. So they've stumbled there. Because for a while, it looked like the Greens might actually become the biggest party in this country. And then again, they had a couple of political scandals there. But they've still had a massive surge in popularity in recent months. So I think a lot of them have gone to the Greens, really. And that, to me, further proves the point that if CDU voters are going to the Greens, that means the Greens can't be all that left. Yeah.
Yeah.
If you think about it.
Do you think it also, though, that it could be in a country that maybe has from an outsider's perspective, a little bit more reason than maybe some of the people in my country? It's like, it's pretty clear with like what's happening every year with the weather that it's like, oh, we are in a crisis. The crisis is coming. And if one party is branding themselves as like, we're the party that's trying to like address the crisis, some people might be like, well, I'm going to kind of, what don't you guys have a expression in German, like bite in the sour apple or something? Yeah.
Yes, there is something to it. But I do also want to sort of push back against that whole notion of sort of the Americans being silly people, because what you will find, and I think that's true anywhere, like if you meet people on an individual level, most people you will find are pretty reasonable, and I find that with most Americans that I've met as well, pretty reasonable. And but what you find sort of as groups, they become less and less reasonable. And that's true anywhere, not just in the US. So that's number one. And then number two, also, I think one of the issues that you have as well with your political system over there is that with having just the two parties and those big monoliths, I feel you're just really underrepresented. Like, I feel there's just a lot of people who are not being represented. And the way you've set up your system is you're really driven by the fringes of either one of those parties, where it's really like, they get more and more extremes essentially, and representing less and less people. So that whole chunk in the middle, that's again sort of center left, center right, most of them pretty reasonable people, where I would say most Americans are pretty reasonable. They just have different political opinions, which is fine. But then they're not really represented by the crazy people on either in either party.
I see, the way I see it is more like, I think the problem is that it's become, and all of these terms have gotten so overused, but this like identity politics, where it's like, I think there's a lot of like reasonable conservatives, and they might have different opinions than me about, things like abortion, for example. And that's fine. I think that's acceptable. It's like people are allowed to have different opinions. The problem is then something like climate change. They're like, well, part of the thing with being a person who's on team no abortion is that also like climate change doesn't exist. So sure, okay, like that's not really my issue anyways, but like I'll hop on board with that.
I'm part of the team now.
I'm part of the team. And so and that happens on both sides.
It's that whole tribalism issue is what you're saying,
Exactly. And it definitely happens on the left as well. But
I mean, maybe that's a good bridge to the Greens, actually, to what I was saying about the Greens, which is, I think, what the conservatives in the US, specifically the Republicans, have been dealing with really well, is that whole naming game. Like, I don't know if you're familiar with Frank Luntz. Have you heard of him? Political strategist, genius, evil genius, you should say, but genius when it comes to branding and naming things. Like, he was responsible for a lot of the way the Bush administration, the second one, sort of enacted certain laws, named them and branded them,
Patriot Act,
all of this sort of stuff. Like, because what he's really, really good at is figuring out what kind of words trigger people, create positive or negative reactions in people. He runs a lot of these like focus groups, and out of that, he just comes up with these terms. He just basically, he's like a stand-up comic. He tests all of these terms on these people and figures out, okay, which ones do they react to strongly, which ones do they react to strongly positively or strongly negatively, right? And then he uses that as an advisor to politicians, in his case specifically the Republicans, and that's why they have just consistently beaten the Democrats at just naming things really, really well, and naming whatever the Democrats are coming up with, and then they've just dominated the conversation for so long. And like one of the terms that they've come up with is this, for instance, virtual signaling, and as much as that in and of itself is already like an overused term, I feel, and this is to me is a little bit the connection to the Greens, where they do a lot of virtual signaling, where they sort of will signal, they say all the right things to sort of the progressive and left side of their party or the political spectrum and the populace, but then when they actually get into power, it's like, but now we're in power and we need to do the right thing. We need to do the responsible thing.
We have to think about the economy.
Yeah, we just have to think about the economy.
Guys.
You can see that quite clearly now, actually, with because they are in government. They are in a coalition currently with the CDU in
the Greens are.
The Greens are in Baden-Württemberg, in one of the states. And there you can see it very, very clearly. Having said, I mean, that state in and of itself is already quite conservative, because like the whole south is quite conservative in Germany. But there you can just really, really tell. It's like it's a match made in heaven. There, it's a bunch of conservatives together. One of them a little bit more green, the Greens, and the others just traditional Christian values party. And yeah, that's what it is. We just care about cars and stuff.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's also an interesting. Right, we're getting kind of off the topic here, but it's an interesting
I'm just really
thing.
bashing the Greens. Fuck them. I'm not. I might actually end up voting for them.
No, but I think an interesting thing generally about like what my perception of like a Green Party, right, is like they're like, we need to move to renewable energy and like put focus on this, and and
that's a big part of the platform, to be fair.
Yeah, but to me also, I'm like, it should in a way be a conservative position, because it's like, if you are paying any attention, that's the way the market is going. Like, it's going to be forced that way. So if, as a business person, why wouldn't you be like, yeah,
you as a business person, Pat.
Me as a business-minded thinker.
As a business-minded fisherman.
Yeah. But I mean, it just seems like, to me, those things, it makes sense to me. Like, yeah, like kind of conservative business type minds, and this, idea that it's progressive to.
But I mean, if you are going to have coalitions anyway, like, listen, most parties won't be able to stand for a whole government on their own anyway. So if you're going to have coalitions anyway, and you need to come up with this compromises, why already start from that position, right?
Yeah.
So why already include all of this stuff? To begin with, you're going to have to make those compromises later anyway. But if you it's a classic thing in negotiation. If you already start from a compromise position, then the compromise you're going to come up with is going to be even further down the line. So that's one of the issues I have with them as well. But then, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, okay. So I don't want us to go too long here. So, but I feel like we've kind of laid out what the ballot looks like. We've talked about the parties.
Very briefly, by the way. So basically, it is actually huge, long fucking... Like, if you actually want to look at it, literally, I don't know if you're going to put up a picture of this, but it's a huge fucking list, because it does have all the direct candidates. That includes all the tiny parties as well, right? So you have a ton of names in there. And then on the bottom... a ton of parties, and then you just make, two little X's. So it is actually like a massive looking piece of paperwork,
Yeah.
Most people now, I read a statistic recently where I think it was a lot of people. I think it must have been like 50% or something have now chosen to vote via mail. I wanted to do it as well, but I've chosen now to do it in person next week, because I want to take my kid with me and basically just show him the ropes. So it's like, look, this is how we do it. This is an election Sunday. Let's do it.
It's a hashtag learning moment.
Yes. Yes. And then we're going to go to a gangbang afterwards, because it's Berlin. Yeah. And
so you queue for 3 hours before you get into the gang bang.
Yeah, it is at the election center, so you have to wait. You have to wait till they're done. So that's why I wanted to do it in person. But generally, there's a lot of voting by mail happening, and it's and this is why I want to say this. It's very uncontroversial in our country.
Yeah, as it should be.
And people just doing it. Mostly has to do with the pandemic situation, of course.
Yeah.
But I think as a result of that, I think it's going to become more and more normal when people realize how convenient it is. For instance, every one of my grandparents that's still alive, they've been voting via mail for a while, because it's like, I don't want to go down there to some fucking school to make it, to vote. I'm just going to vote via mail. It's so much easier. Because the thing is, you also get it mailed, like you get a letter from the government a couple of weeks before, basically say, hey, this is your election thing. This shows that you're registered here. Bring this to the vote with you, just to show that you've got it and that you're eligible to vote. Bring an ID with you, blah blah blah. Or use this thing, vote here, and just send it to us. And then it's already has sort of the envelope in it, already stamped and everything. So just send it in. So it's really easy.
Yeah, no, I mean, the funny thing about it becoming such an issue in the States is that my parents have voted by mail for like, I don't know, however long, years and years, as long as I can remember. And when I first was able to vote when I was 18, they were like, sign up for vote by mail. And their whole thing was like, then you can sit down with the ballot. There's a bunch of things on it, and you can actually like read and figure out what you're voting, and you don't have to like, make a cheat sheet and whatever, then try to go to some polling center on a Tuesday. Like, so.
But your parents are also lesbians.
Yeah.
So they're daughters of the devil.
I went to a Jesuit Catholic university.
Great.
And when I, at some point, one of my friends was like, wait, you guys like aren't Catholic? Your parents are gay. Do you guys like worship the devil? Like, he was legitimately, he was kind of joking, but 70% of the question was like, he was like, do you?
That's so funny. That reminds me of the questions I received when I was an exchange student in the United States, and people sort of asked me, you're from Germany? Do you guys have refrigerators? Do you have Coca-Cola? It's like, I would say probably the percentage of Coca-Cola is probably higher than refrigerators. So that was the question I was most outraged with.
Anya and I were on a road trip once, and anytime we'd meet like these like a middle-aged American couple, like while we were traveling or something, there's like my butthole would kind of tighten up, like, please don't say something fucking embarrassing. And sure enough, one time we're at this hotel and we're like, oh, you're from Germany. We went to Germany. This was before 9/11, so like not a lot of people had cell phones or something, and it was like, fuck, like, I'm sure they had, like, and Anya was like, what? And so then this became like a joke where it was like, oh yeah, before 9/11, like, Germany they didn't even have landlines. Like, they were using carrier pigeons before 9/11,
Yes, that was a big game changer for us.
Yeah.
We're finally allowed.
The towers came down and you guys were like,
our reception went up.
Yeah.
Which is why we're still to this very, very grateful.
Yeah.
Joking. That was
never forget.
Never forget how good reception is now.
Yeah.
Which ironically it's not anymore.
Yeah.
So there should be another one.
Yeah.
I'm joking.
Okay, so but should we maybe talk a little bit about, like, I guess what I want to ask about the chancellor candidates is, I don't know them specifically, and I don't think we need to like necessarily get into them.
We should
unless
talk
there's something you
a
want
little.
to say about
There
it.
is something, because that's one of my big gripes that I have with the media about this thing, is because was it last week? So they have this whole thing, because you guys, and this is your guys' fault, you have this whole TV duels,
Yeah.
right?
The debates.
The
yeah.
TV debate. Well, duels, come on.
Yeah, okay. Trump turned them into duels. They were debates before.
So they have this whole TV debate thing going on, and the media in Germany is the West German media. Mm-hmm. So they've had forever this whole infatuation with sort of the American media, and they fancy themselves like little Walter Cronkites, and so they all want to do that. Like, whatever is happening in the US, that's what we need to do as well, right? So we've had these TV debates now since 2000s, I think it was. First one was with, I think, Schröder and Merkel, if I remember correctly. So we've had that happening for like the past 20 years. And at the time, it was still sort of the two big parties. It was the CDU-CSU and SPD. So that was the format, just like in the US. Perfect. But then the next couple election, and the more and more the populace and as well as the vote gets fractured in a system that just has more and more people, it becomes very obviously more and more unfair to just invite two people, right? So what they then did, they one election, they had this huge round where they had like 6 or 7 people on stage, and you can't hold, because they do always market it like that, like a TV debate American style, confrontational, direct, dun, hard-hitting question, bam, 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 let him fight it out like a fucking boxing match, right? And you can't do that with 7 people. And then the big complaint at the time was, well, I only had 7 minutes and 56 seconds, and they had like 8 minutes and 12. Outrage, political, a scandal, blah, blah, blah. And then it just became nonsense, and it became a question of at what percentage are they allowed to be in the TV duel, which one not, blah, 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 blah. And then there was a whole thing for the last 10 years. So in the recent ones, they've had 3. So they basically go by polls now. Mm-hmm. And so the 3 biggest ones they take, and it was the Greens, Annalena Baerbock, it was SPD, Olaf Scholz, and it was the CDU-CSU, Armin Laschet. And so they had a debate, let's call it. The thing is, and again, this is sort of why it's a big gripe of mine, the format in and of itself is nonsense. Like, you're not really going to get out of it anything interesting. What I did find interesting in terms of the polling afterwards, how people perceived it, how the candidates did, is among the, I believe it was the 50 years and older, so among the older crowd, apparently Olaf Scholz, the SPD candidate, did quite well. Mm-hmm. Sorry, he did the best. Among the 35 and younger, Annalena Baerbock, the candidate from the Greens, actually did considerably better than both of the men. Mm-hmm. So that's an interesting take on that as well, just to sort of see like how diverse it is and what kind of a generational difference there is in this country just as much as in a lot of other countries. There's this huge generational divide, and a lot of it is centered around, I believe, the whole issue of climate change and how parties act on that, or promising to act or not act on it. So that's a huge divide, I believe, in most countries, including yours and including ours.
Yeah. So nobody likes the CDU guy, basically.
Everybody hates him for good reason. He's a tool. I don't know if I mentioned this before. He's a bit of, like this. He's the definition of what everybody hates about a career politician.
Yeah.
Someone who's inept and who's just been around long enough. You know, he's
like,
met
it's my
enough.
turn.
Exactly. He's the my turn guy. It's my turn. You know how you have the My Pillow guy? He's the my turn guy.
Okay. And so what about...
And he's as coherent as the My Pillow guy, just to be clear.
And so again, this goes back to my most of this podcast is me being like, I don't understand. Can you explain? But like the prime minister in Germany, how much direct power do they have? Because like this is a problem in the States, right? It's like presidents actually are taking like more and more power, more and more of these like presidential orders that affect real change, which can be a good thing if your person is in power, but can also be a really bad thing if...
I mean, to be fair, though, that is an emergency situation in your system as well, though, because it's not supposed to work that way. Like, all of these it is supposed to come through the Congress. Like, all of these laws are supposed to be voted on and enacted through the Congress. So all these presidential orders in and of itself is already sort of extraordinary situation where the presidents themselves feel they're put in this extraordinary position where they have to do it because the gridlock in Congress is just so extreme.
Yeah. It's almost like... I don't know, like the system somehow isn't working.
What? You mean the best system in the world?
Yeah, I know, it's crazy.
The original democracy that was handed down by Jesus is not working
he came
as
down
intended?
with the tablets and he said, all men are created equal if they're white.
And own land.
Yeah, and own land. Yeah,
don't
rich
forget
white people.
I was just gonna say, don't forget about indentured servitude.
Yeah. But so, like, what is the?
I've had indentured servitude in my past, actually, not my personal past, but my family. Anyway.
Really?
Yes. I
and
come.
That'll be the next podcast.
I come from a long line of poverty.
Yeah. But so, what is the prime minister like? How much effect do they have? Especially in a coalition government.
So to go to your actual question, not as much as in the US, actually, because so for instance, they don't have, since they're not presidents, so they're actually not formally the head of state. The head of state of Germany is the president, so we have a president. And he's like a figurehead, you know, like those little bobbleheads that you have in your cars. That's our president, essentially. He's there for formal functions where he needs to represent the country.
And does he get elected, or how?
He doesn't. He does get elected, but not by us. He gets elected by the parliament.
Okay.
So he gets elected by the representatives.
Big my turn energy.
Yes. Which is interesting why he wouldn't go for that. That would have been a much better job for him. You know, he could have actually gotten elected there.
Yeah. Photo ops, it sounds lovely.
Yes, it does actually. So he is the formal head of state, or she, whoever it is the head of state, is the president, and the chancellor is the head of the government. Mm-hmm. So the way the government is run is, so they're the executive. So they are in charge of all the ministries and them running well and executing all the laws that the legislative, which is the parliament, comes up with. Now, obviously, since they also sit in the legislative body, meaning the parliament, they propose a lot of the laws that the parliament should come up with. And obviously, since they're the government, they have the largest percentage of the seats in the parliament, so most of the laws that they come up with and propose will be enacted by them later on through the executive branch. So their power as head of state, as an actual chancellor, is really just to sort of set the agenda for these things, where they basically say, hey, this is what we should be doing, this is what we want to go for. Now, since it's a coalition, they can't really do that exclusively on their own anyway. They kind of have to wheel and deal with their coalition partners about the agenda. And what they've done now for the last couple of decades, they even set almost like a contract. Like at the beginning of the coalition negotiations, when they said, oh, are we going to work together in this government or not? They basically create these very intricate lists of like, this is what we're going to do, sometimes very, very specific. This is one of the things that people got mad for at the Liberals, because they had there's the tiny issue party. They're really just there for businessmen to get better deals on taxation. That's their whole purpose of existence. And they did that, where they had this really tiny issue where they worked together with the CDU, build a new coalition, created a new government, and of course they wanted a lot of different things, but the one thing that they really wanted was they wanted the VAT, the value-added tax for hotels and like hostels and stuff like that. So any type of bed and breakfast where you could not just eat but also sleep, to go down from the regular 19% to the reduced 7% that we also have. That was the big thing. Like, we need that in this.
Yeah.
It's like, this is our make or break.
This is our breaking.
This is our line in the sand.
Yeah.
And everybody looked at it as like, in this government you're supposed to represent all Germans, like all people, and like yeah, but about this percent, about this VAT. So that's a thing where they've done now, where they sometimes like the points in there are like really minuscule, where like down to the smallest thing, where like, we're not gonna work with you unless you agree to this. And some of them are incredibly vague. Like, a lot of it sounds like like a mission statement by a startup. We want to change the world and want to be good to people. E-commerce is gonna save this planet.
Yeah.
Sure, yes.
We have to build infrastructure.
We are for diversity.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. What are you going to do about it? No, we're just for it. That's my point. So they build these contracts essentially at the beginning of, or at the end of the negotiations for these coalitions. And then they will act on those and propose, either, depending on the contract, very specifically, or generally laws about the things that they agreed on, propose that to the parliament, then the parliament votes on it, and then if it goes through, they will then enact it.
Okay. So I have two things I wanted to touch on before we get to the end here. So the first one, I was talking to my godfather that we were going to do this, and he had a good question that I thought was interesting, he's like, what do you think maybe other countries in Europe or, other people in the world don't understand about German politics or the German political process?
Right. That's a good question. I don't know. That would require a level of awareness of an outside perspective that I might not have.
Yeah,
or that we Germans, maybe that's what people don't understand. We're not really aware of what other people think. I'm joking.
Or I guess maybe another way to phrase the question might be like, I mean, obviously different people have different issues, right? Like the Green Party has their, maybe their environmental thing, or maybe the CDU has a tax thing. I don't know. But like, what do you think really gets Germans like fired up,
riled
politically,
up in the streets? Well, maybe that's an interesting thing, because I think a lot of people think, myself included, they're very lethargic people when it comes to political issues. Because like, you see the French and then the streets like every other month about one issue or another, and like, Germans don't really. You see demonstrations, specifically in Berlin. People just go on the street sort of to demonstrate, but it's very sort of almost ineffectual because it's just all very. The demonstrations,
I have to say, here always tend to seem to be kind of just like a party. Yeah. And I'm like, I mean, it's one way to get people out, but
but it is ineffectual. Yeah. That's the other thing. So I feel that, I think sort of the way political opinions shift in this country is sometimes a bit interesting, because I think it's very much, maybe what it is that Germans as a larger whole, and this is always difficult for me, because my dad had this thing, like after the fall of the Berlin Wall and that whole transition period to the unification, where he sort of said, he had this moment of realization when he saw people out and what they wanted. Sort of like, oh yeah, we want the Deutschmark, we want like that great currency, and we don't want our own nice socialist state, democratic socialist state, but we actually want to be part of the West, and we want to be able to shop bananas. Where he sort of realized, oh, I'm the minority in this country. Like, I am the outlier. Like, because normally you have that classic bias where you think you project your own opinion. It's like, oh, everybody thinks like me, because like what I think is perfectly reasonable. So clearly everybody who is reasonable should think like me. So you had that moment of realization where, oh no, wait, hold on, I'm the outlier. I'm the weird one here. So I feel that same way now, where I'm like, I don't know if I can really speak sort of to the German soul and the German voters' opinion and what moves us as a country, because I feel like I'm the weird one out. But and maybe that comes from this perspective, I feel like political opinion shifts very, very slowly. It's very tectonic plates movement. Unless, similar to tectonic plates, there's a volcano. Unless there's something like Fukushima that happened that really turned the country and our opinion on things like nuclear energy, just turn it around. So whenever there's like a real crisis, something that you can actually see and you can go like, whoa, this is where actually sort of we can switch, and then we can switch on a dime. Like, it is crazy. Like, the whole Fukushima thing was insane to me, because like that whole, like, the Greens have been banging on about nuclear energy, the dangers of it, blah blah blah, for 30 years and 40 years up until that point. And they gained a following, they rose in political powers. They even were part of the government then in the early 2000s, but it really didn't gain traction with the larger whole of German population. But once that happened, and the Greens didn't even need to be in the government at that point, it was Angela Merkel who then sort of changed things around. It's like, boom, it changed on a dime. So I do feel, as much as Germans themselves like to believe that, and there's still this old stereotypes about Germans being sort of very, reasonable, very straightforward, sort of clear thinking, you really need to grab us with some massive catastrophe or atrocity, really to change, to change our minds. Otherwise, things just kind of chug along. Like, I think that's a lot of the German system. It's just chugging along. Like, this whole issue that we have about the pension system that's been failing for like the last 20, 30 years, and it just keeps on going. People change a little bit here, a little bit there. Same with the taxation system, where everybody feels like we're all getting fucked here. Where in general, everybody agrees, yes, we should have taxes. And in general, it's okay that we have a progressive tax system. In general, it's okay that we're taxed more than in countries like the US. That's generally, everybody agrees with that. But then when you go into the specifics and how incredibly complex everything is with all the different little exceptions, everybody then also goes like, this is just crazy, this is insane. But again, the system just keeps chugging along because it's such a behemoth at this point that you can't really change it unless you completely overhaul it. And that leads to an incredibly dangerous situation, because you can just fuck it up. Like, you make it completely new, you could just fuck it up completely.
If you tear everything out, what comes back might be worse.
Yes.
And history tells us oftentimes it is.
Oftentimes it does, yes.
Yeah. Well, I could keep asking you questions about Germany
Do
forever.
so. I've got time.
But okay, well then I'll ask this before I get to my last thing here. But like when you I was Googling during my German learning experience, I was kind of having some.
Is that what you call that phase of your life?
Yeah, it was a phase.
My German.
Yeah, I was experimenting with learning German.
I was experimenting with German. I think you're still in that phase with your German girlfriend and everything.
Yeah.
I'm in my German learning phase.
I'm German curious.
Yes.
But I was Googling about it, and it's like, oh, like this is it's like one of the most they say it's like the best language to learn for like earning money or whatever. Like, I was looking for, I was Googling.
Who said this? Google told you this?
I was like Googling reasons to learn German.
What kind of a blog was this that you found this on?
I mean, it was on the internet. It must be true. That's how it works. Is that not how the internet works? But I mean, I guess my point is just that, like, Germany to me is like a country where, from an outsider's perspective, I mean, I think within Europe, people would say this, people coming from the Middle East that I've met who now live here, came here for a reason. Americans have this perspective of Germany as kind of like, oh, this is like a system where shit's like working pretty well. Like, it's, maybe it's not perfect, but it's like, it's going pretty good.
Yeah.
And so then it's interesting to like live here and meet Germans, and then you start to get into like, oh well, like this thing doesn't work so well, or oh, like the kind of Wi-Fi situation here is somehow super shitty, which is
the digital infrastructure is the absolute worst.
Yeah, which is just something you wouldn't expect.
Because this is the thing. This is again this thing about stereotypes. Like, Germany as a country and the people of Germany have this still this old stereotype. Oh, it's this engineering country. It's just a country full of engineers and everything is so technologically advanced. And I feel like, no, but we're not Japan anymore. Like, it used to be kind of like that, but we've moved away from that at least 30 years ago. And it's just, I don't know. I don't know what it is, what kind of shift. I'm sure there's some kind of social cultural shift that's part of the reason for that as well. Part of it is the economic shift in sort of a move away from sort of the manufacturing jobs to more sort of the service-oriented jobs, specifically pre-financial crisis, I should say. Now we need to define which crisis we're talking about. Pre-financial crisis to like the financial industries. There was a big push towards that area as well, which, I mean, after the consolidation, after the financial crisis, still, I mean, it's a huge, massive fucking sector. And so I think people still have this perception, we still have that stereotype about Germans, but it's so not true anymore. Like I really feel, and I don't want to sound too much like a declinist, but like I feel like that one of the symbols of this for me is, so all of the technology for, well, not all, but a lot of the technologies for high-speed railways was developed here in Germany. But where it was built was in China. Yeah. So they outsourced all of this stuff. They sold all of this technology and all of this stuff to China. And they've got this incredible high-speed rail system now all throughout China. And the railway here in Germany is shit. It's just shit. They're still building new tracks here and there, new connections, but it's all shit. And it's like one of those things where I feel like, well, why can't we reinvigorate, improve our infrastructure on multiple different levels? Again, the railway system, the digital infrastructure, and all that. Why can't we? And it seems like, and it's not that you can't even blame like a gridlocked political system like you could in the US. It's more of, again, I feel it's this whole thing of like everybody is sort of content enough with, again, it's this whole thing of Germans as a country and as a people are generally conservative, where it's like, let's protect the status quo. Let's not make too many rash moves.
People want to come here.
Exactly.
Why would we rock the boat?
Exactly. So it's a lot of that where it's like, let's not change too much. It might end up badly. So let's just kind of keep it the way it is, even if it's sort of slowly degrading.
Yeah. Well, is there any like in a big thing in the States, and especially I feel like post-pandemic, where you started seeing like where there were all these like real clear examples of the fact that there's no infrastructure for industry, like we don't build any of the medical equipment that we need or whatever. And that was something I had heard, like, for example, Germany invested all of this money that developed solar technology, right? And then once the technology was developed, all of it started getting produced in China,
but it's
like much cheaper, and so.
But that's a slightly different issue to me, because that's a matter of scale, and with this type of things, you always have to work with economies of scale. So to produce something really cheaply, you have to produce it en masse. So the issue that with Germany and the way that part of Germany likes to see itself is the sort of high technology, cutting edge stuff where we develop all the stuff, but you can't all produce and manufacture all of this stuff here because just the scale is too small. Sort of just to produce it for specifically the German markets, and then the way the production capabilities that we have, I think you just can't do it that way, here at least. So that makes sense to me. It's just a matter then of the question there becomes, is it just a transfer of technology, or is it a transfer of knowledge as well? So I don't know the intricacies there of how much those Chinese companies just took that and then ran with it and just sort of outpaced them because they just make it so much cheaper, so everyone is now buying their stuff, or how much of that is licensed, where basically German companies basically go like, well, take this, you produce it for us, and we'll just get a cut of it. So I don't know the intricacies of that there. And then also, to be fair to a lot of those companies, solar power and those technologies weren't exclusively developed here. So I mean, a lot of this was developed in other countries, including China as well. So you have to keep that in mind as well. Having said that, I do feel like in some of those areas, like solar power, we were sort of early leaders, but then eventually we sort of get overtaken by just bigger markets. Because the thing with Germany you always have to keep in mind is, it's, as a country, in terms of its power, it's essentially too big for Europe. That it, just by the scale of the country and the number of people, it's too big for Europe, really, where it's naturally in a dominant position in Europe, but it's too small to matter globally. Right? So it's not going to be one of the big players. It's not going to be a dominating factor in the world, because we also don't have that big of a colonial past where, like France, we're still on some a nuclear committee that still gets to decide
Yeah.
all those sort of things. So we're not going to be a big player and be a part of sort of the world dominance game. But within Europe, naturally, like we always have to be sort of in the dominant position. And Germany has struggled with that a lot because we don't really want to take the leadership role, partially because, of our past. We're like, we also want to sort of appear like we want to be the bad person. Because as a leader, you always have that situation where you're going to end up being the bad guy. Because if you keep calling the shots, things go badly. Even if things don't go badly, people are always unhappy about one thing or another, speaking from experience.
Yeah.
So we naturally, from our past, not wanting to be the bad guy again, naturally avoid that position. So we go like, no, why don't we all do it together? Why don't we all decide together? That naturally leads to a fucked up European Union.
Yeah.
And but the reality is we just have that leadership position just by, again, just the size of the country. And also, as a result of that, as a sort of history-long result of that, the size of our economic power, and we do have a lot of responsibility as a result of that. And I think we want to always skirt around the responsibility a little bit. Comes the same thing with like defense budgets as well, where as part of the NATO, we're one of the many countries who always underneath sort of the promised percentage of what we have to spend on defense and what we have to spend on the NATO as well, where we're always like, yeah, I know we should spend like 2% of our like federal budget, but come on, we've got the US. Come on, do we really have to? I mean, come on. So it's one of those where I'm like, yeah, but we do have responsibilities as well. Like either you're consistent about it and just say, well, maybe the whole NATO thing is a bit antiquated and we should get rid of it. Or if you're saying, no, it's not, we definitely need it, well, then, hold your end of the bargain up if you can.
Yeah. Well, okay, so let's take us back to the German election to end here. So
you don't want to talk about NATO more?
I mean, NATO's a fun subject.
That was my strategy for this podcast, because I was wondering, why do you bring me back? So I felt like maybe if I go even less funny now, you'll definitely bring me back for a third time.
Yeah, that's actually the key to my whole comedy. It's
okay,
like, and the podcast. Yeah, that's how I book,
Good.
The more serious we could get, the better. I mean,
Fantastic.
could you maybe start talking about like individual statutes within the German
please.
law? No, but so
I could actually. Let's talk about
save that for episode
Let's talk
3.
about the 2G system.
But one thing I thought was kind of a funny thing that I just learned about that I wanted to ask you about, and maybe is a good note to end on, since this is hypothetically, technically a comedy podcast, so there's this party in Germany that's like Anya was telling me about, that it's like the Satire Party.
Oh, yeah.
And their whole thing is that they just do stuff that's like, they take positions that are kind of like the opposite or like more ridiculous than normal parties.
Which is become more and more difficult for them, but yes, that's their whole thing. So they're a satire party. So you have to sort of, to explain what it is, you kind of have to know a little bit about the background of it. So first of all, yes, there is a satire party in Germany called The Party. That's their name. They're called The Party.
Okay.
And how they were born is, so we have. I don't know what is a good example for that in the US. So basically, we have these magazines, satire magazines, and Mad Magazine.
Yeah, I was gonna say Mad Magazine, but I think we're dating ourselves a little bit with that reference.
A little bit, yeah. I don't know what is it. Think of it like a paper version of The Onion.
Okay. Yes. Yeah.
So we have that. That's called the Titanic, and so they've been sort of this long running publication. And the chief editor of this, Martin Sonneborn, that's his name. I think this whole thing started as a stunt. It was just essentially like a media stunt. He founded The Party because he thought it was like, all of this shit is so ridiculous. Let's make fun of it, but let's make fun of it in an institutional way, similar to how John Oliver founded his super PAC,
Yeah.
like as a thing to make fun of the whole system.
Yeah.
He
And
actually
to point
he has
out
an actual super PAC,
Yeah.
now, right? So, but unlike John Oliver, Martin Sonneborn, essentially after they've created the party, they started, because to make it real, they put up candidates. At the very beginning, I believe there was a couple of comedians that did that. I think still to this day, a couple of them are like comedians that are sort of like the prime candidate for like the chancellorship. But then after a while, so they've done that for a couple of elections, all of a sudden they did actually get votes. Like some of them did get direct, like himself, Martin Sonneborn, and like a couple of others did actually get a direct mandate to the parliament. So he was in the federal parliament, and then because we have this other election, the European Parliament, he's now in the European Parliament as a representative of Germany. And so
They're like, why are you here? And he's like, I write for the Titanic.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just, they've made this weird turn now where they're still a satirical party, but they still feel as an actual representative, like we have this responsibility to also, just do the work while we're here. So I think a lot of what they focus on is just questioning whoever is in power, either in the European Parliament or in the federal parliament in Germany. They just question them and try to call them out on just the stupid nonsense that they do. And I mean, obviously, there's ripe. It's satire. Everything is ripe for satire, specifically in ridiculous times such as these.
Yeah.
So they do have a lot of, something, a lot of to draw
I could
from.
imagine if I did that as like this is a joke, and then I got elected, that I would have the feeling of like, well, shit, what am I supposed to do now?
I'm sure they had very similar feelings at the time.
Yeah.
Where they're like, this was a joke. Like, what the fuck? This is probably how Trump must have felt,
Yeah.
right? I just wanted to sell a couple of real estate
I thought
buildings.
the hats were nice. The hats were great. Like,
they were great.
Yeah.
We sold a lot of them.
yeah. Number one merch of 2020.
Is that official? I would not be surprised. I would not be surprised. Not 2020, probably 2016. Yeah, but still.
No, but I mean, in a way, that's kind of beautiful. Because I think it is what I wish in like the American system more is like you do get these kind of performative things where the Senate committee is like grilling Mark Zuckerberg about shit. But like,
it's really just for show, yeah.
It's really just for show. It would be nice to have someone there who was maybe going at the other people on the committee and being,
I mean, what would be even nicer if it wouldn't just be this public show if we're grilling this guy because, stick it to the man, but then out of that comes, here's a new legislation on how we're actually going to regulate this company. That would be nice. That would be even nicer.
What would be nice is like if maybe just like the officials like represented like the wants and needs of the people.
What?
Somehow. I don't know.
What are you talking about?
Here.
Have you thought of the horseshoe bat?
Yeah, that's true.
I think you're not taking that into
consideration. The plight of the horseshoe bat is my number one party platform piece.
Which, interestingly enough, I'm very disappointed by the Animal Rights Party. They don't have that on their current agenda for the federal election.
Well, it's because the horseshoe bat is gone. They built the bridge. It's
dead.
Dead. It's no longer in danger. It's extinct.
They're all gone now.
Yeah.
It's true. That's true. Yeah, so yeah, when you walk around, you can find these satirical party posters, which a lot of them are quite fun. Having said that, they never pass. So that's an important thing that I've completely forgot to talk about. We have one of the things that you need to understand about the German system is we have a minimum requirement to get into parliament. So one of the things that came out of the Weimar Republic, one of the things that people felt that led to the Nazis taking over and the political spectrum being so fractured is there was no minimum requirement for entry into the parliament, which meant at the time they had a lot of coalitions of like 5 or 6 parties and never got anything done. And that was because sort of basically every party that got any votes just got into parliament, right? Mm-hmm. And so the way it works now, as a party, you only can get in if you pass 5%. Mm-hmm. So if you don't get 5% of the vote, of the second vote that is, you don't get in as a party. Now, with the Satire Party that we just talked about, and we just said they're in the parliament, well, they're in the parliament as individuals. So if they get an individual mandate, so they're like in, but the party isn't in.
For example,
exactly.
The party is doing super well in like this area of Friedrichstein, for example. So
that's exactly what it is. That's exactly. They have only ever had, I don't know the exact number, but they only have had like 1, maybe 2 candidates in the parliament or representatives in the parliament, and it's always been from Berlin, I believe. So it's always just the people from Berlin who, as a joke, vote for these guys, and then they get in because there's too many of them who are just regular jokesters. But as a party, the party has never been in the parliament because they don't pass the 5% hurdle that you need nationwide. So what that means is then you have individual representatives that represent their districts, but they can form like a party coalition. They don't have this. And that's one of the things I think that also annoys a lot of people within Germany. They have this whole thing where, like in the UK, they call them party whips, where sort of their official function is to basically get everyone in line. So when they vote on things, they basically make sure, even though they're all individual representatives and they're supposed to represent their district specifically, when they vote on things, they want to make sure that everyone in the CDU votes the same way on this thing, so to make sure they get through.
States, actually. Yeah,
exactly. So that can only work if you are represented as a whole party in the parliament anyway. Yeah. So we do have like some of these tiny parties, like the party, do have representatives in the parliament as well. But they're kind of ineffectual.
To me, like the party, the political. Maybe I'm coming from a perspective of like politics is quite broken and politicians are quite corrupt generally, and so having someone who's like making fun of this, I think it's just, and I guess also I like comedy, so I think it, like what a hilarious and amazing idea. But is the general perception of those guys like, what the fuck are they doing? This is like our country, like, or does everybody kind of be like, that's funny? Yeah, the CDU said
everybody certainly isn't,
clinks, but they're saying mehr criminals or something.
Yeah. So everybody certainly isn't thinking of it. I think specifically the people who vote for them, and I think a large part, like I don't vote for them, but I do find them funny. Yeah. So I think there's a part of the country that definitely finds it funny and finds it like, oh, cute. But the main issue, and I think why even the people who wouldn't vote for them and might not find them funny are not bothered about them, is because again they're ineffectual. They have like one or two people in the parliament, and we just talked about it. It's a parliament of like 700 people. Who gives a fuck if two of them are from a satirical party that every once in a while, because of the rules of the parliament, like every couple of months they can make a speech and then they will say something either funny or cutting edge against the government. The government just, whatever. So
okay, nice. Well, I think the party is a good point for us to leave, unless is there anything else that you feel like needs to be added?
The Greys. No, I'm joking.
Yeah.
I always find it funny. Like one thing I always find funny is like that whole coloring system, right, around the parties. I never understand how they really came up with that. Like that whole thing of that certain parties have certain colors and they've kind of stuck with it through the years, even though they changed their brand image. Like the CDU, for instance, like their whole thing is like black.
Yeah.
But then if you watch their posters and stuff for the last, I think it's like 12, I don't know when they came up with that change of brand image, but like for the last 12 years, it's always orange. Like it's a lot of orange. And like
not the color I would choose.
Not the color I would choose either. But so I'm finding myself now wondering, why do we still affiliate them with black when it's clear orange that they want? And why don't we adhere to their wishes?
They don't want to have to come out and say, "Can you guys start using orange?" But they just keep hoping that people will be like,
"Don't you get it? Like we've been telling you this, showing you this for 12 years. You're not getting it." Yeah. So I find this whole coloring system a bit weird. Like I don't understand where that came from.
Which brings us back to our original point, which is why the fuck would you choose brown as your color?
Yes.
I mean,
specifically if you're anti-brown.
Specifically if you're anti-brown. Yeah.
Like their color really should have been white, right?
Yeah.
I mean, really.
Yeah. Yeah,
I'm sure. Like, if you have an actual historian on the podcast, they would be able to explain specifically, not maybe all colors, but in the case of why the Nazis had brown, I'm sure there's a reason for it. But it's fascinating.
Which, if you do, get in the comments. Let us know.
Actually,
well, awesome.
They already had a white party. The color was taken.
I've linked to the article.
I've linked to the Onion article that explains it in detail.
Well, thank you for coming and doing your best to explain the German political system and election.
It's always great when you explain something and you realize I don't really know what I'm talking about.
Well, I mean, you knew a lot more than me, and probably most of the 30 people who are going to watch this.
Ouch!
Yeah.
Ouch! Get in the comments.
And
Nuke this guy.
But yeah, thank you for coming on again.
Thanks for having
me. And people can find you at comedian Chris D.
That is correct. Yes, that's
below.
Get in the comments. Nuke this guy.
Nuke that guy at Propaganda Comedy.
Propaganda Comedy. Yes. You can find us Laughing Spree Comedy as well.
Laughing Spree Comedy. They host a lot of great shows in Berlin. So if you happen to be someone who's watching in Berlin, come and see one of their amazing shows.
Yes, we actually do with Propaganda Comedy a lot of shows around Europe as well.
Or all around Europe. And a note to other people who host podcasts, do a little research about your guest, just have that information in there up top so that you don't do what I just did. Anywhere in Europe, you can see them at Propaganda Comedy. Give them a follow. Check it out.
Cool. Thanks so much, Pat.
Yeah, that was awesome.